The guard's education. Mitchell Dawson had never been much of a reader. His apartment reflected this reality, sparsely furnished, dominated by a massive television and a refrigerator stocked with beer and frozen dinners. His ex-wife had once complained about his lack of intellectual curiosity, a criticism he dismissed as pretentious nonsense. Prison work didn't require philosophical contemplation. It required vigilance, consistency, and the ability to maintain authority in an environment where weakness was exploited without mercy. Yet here he sat on his worn leather couch, the slim volume of the Book of Five Rings resting in his hands, its weight somehow more substantial than its physical dimension suggested. The introduction explained that Musashi had written the text near the end of his life, after decades of combat and reflection. Mitchell found himself reading slowly, uncharacteristically absorbed. "Perception is strong and sight weak," he read aloud to his empty apartment. "In strategy, it is important to see distant things as if they were close, and to take a distance view of close things." He paused, beer halfway to his lips. The words seemed simple on the surface, but they carried implications that resonated uncomfortably with his daily work. How often had he looked at inmates without truly perceiving them? How many times had he reduced complex human beings to their crimes, their case files, their institutional identities? The television played unwatched in the background as Mitchell continued reading. Musashi wrote about the importance of rhythm, understanding the rhythm of your opponent, of situations, of decay and flourishing. The master swordsman emphasized that true strategy wasn't about domination, but about understanding, timing, and adaptability. Combat, in Musashi's philosophy, was merely the most obvious manifestation of larger principles that governed all human interactions. Mitchell thought about Reeves's posture that morning, the perfect stillness, the measured breathing, the unshakable calm in the face of mockery. Was the man studying these principles? And if so, for what purpose? The next day, Mitchell observed Cell Block D with new attention. He noticed things that had always been there but had faded into the background noise of routine. Reeves moved differently than other inmates. When the cells opened for the morning meal, most men shuffled or swaggered, their body language broadcasting either defeat or aggression. Reeves walked with economy of motion, no wasted energy, no performance. He didn't avoid eye contact, but neither did he issue challenges. He simply moved through space with intentional awareness. During recreation hour in the yard, Mitchell stationed himself where he could observe without obvious surveillance. Reeves stood alone near the far fence, not isolated from others, but maintaining a deliberate distance. His posture suggested the same meditation Mitchell had witnessed in the cell, standing this time, weight balanced, breathing measured. Several younger inmates noticed and began walking toward him, their body language suggesting trouble. Marcus Razor Jenkins led the group. At 27, Jenkins had accumulated a reputation for violence that extended well beyond his initial drug conviction. He collected protection payments from weaker inmates and had hospitalized 2 men in the past year. Mitchell tensed, hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Confrontations in the yard could escalate rapidly, and Reeves's calm demeanor wouldn't save him from Jenkins's crew. But something unexpected happened. Jenkins approached within conversational distance and stopped. The 2 men spoke quietly. Mitchell was too far away to hear the words. Reeves's posture didn't change, but Jenkins's did. The younger man's aggressive stance gradually softened. The conversation lasted perhaps 3 minutes before Jenkins nodded once and walked away, his companions following with visible confusion. Mitchell felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't luck or coincidence. Reeves had somehow diffused a potentially violent encounter through means Mitchell couldn't identify from his position. The guard found himself intensely curious about what words had passed between the 2 men, what strategy Reeves had employed to achieve peaceful resolution. That evening, Mitchell returned to the book with renewed focus. He read about the principle of controlling the enemy's sword, not through superior force, but through strategic positioning and psychological understanding. Musashi wrote, "You can win with a long weapon, and you can win with a short weapon." In short, the way of the Ichi school is the spirit of winning, whatever the weapon and whatever its size. The mockery, the fluorescent lights hummed their perpetual drone through Cell Block D, casting harsh shadows across concrete walls that had witnessed countless moments of human desperation. Officer Mitchell Dawson had worked these corridors for 17 years, long enough that the metallic clang of cell doors and the echoing footsteps had become the soundtrack of his existence. He'd developed a particular expression over those years, a half smirk that suggested he'd seen everything worth seeing and found most of it disappointingly predictable. On this particular Tuesday morning, that expression intensified when he approached cell 47 during his routine rounds. The man inside, known simply as Reeves to the guards and inmates alike, sat cross-legged on his bunk in an unusual posture. His back was perfectly straight, hands resting gently on his knees, eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation. Mitchell had seen plenty of inmates attempt various spiritual transformations over the years, jailhouse conversions that rarely survived beyond the prison walls. But something about Reeves's stillness felt different, almost unnervingly deliberate. "Dawson," Reeves said without opening his eyes, his voice carrying a calm that seemed incongruous with their surroundings. "I have a request." Mitchell stopped, keys jangling at his belt. "That's so? I'd like to request a book from the library." Reeves finally opened his eyes, and Mitchell noticed something he hadn't observed before, a clarity in the man's gaze that suggested layers of hidden depth. "A specific title if it's available." The guard let out a short laugh. "Getting religious on me, Reeves? Gonna tell me you want the Bible? Maybe the Quran?" His voice carried the practiced mockery of someone who'd heard every angle, every attempt at manipulation. "No," Reeves replied with measured patience. "I'm requesting The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi." Mitchell's smirk wavered for just a fraction of a second. The title meant nothing to him, sounded Japanese, maybe some kind of martial arts nonsense. He'd expected something more conventional, something he could easily dismiss. The specificity of the request caught him off guard, but he recovered quickly, his laugh echoing down the cell block with deliberate loudness. "A warrior book. What are you planning, Reeves? Gonna karate chop your way out of here?" His voice rose, performing for the benefit of other inmates who might be listening. "You know what you are. You're a middle-aged man serving 15 years for aggravated assault. Whatever warrior fantasies you're cooking up in that cell, they end right here in this concrete box." Several cells down, someone whistled appreciatively at the guard's put-down. But Reeves didn't react with the anger or deflation Mitchell expected. Instead, the inmate simply nodded, as if acknowledging a simple statement of fact rather than an insult designed to diminish him. "The request stands," Reeves had said quietly. "I'll fill out the proper form if needed." Mitchell walked away, still chuckling, but something gnawed at the edges of his certainty. In his experience, inmates who got mocked usually responded in one of two ways. They either exploded with impotent rage, or they retreated into sullen silence. Reeves had done neither. The man's unshakable composure suggested a foundation Mitchell couldn't quite identify, something that predated these walls and would likely outlast them. As the day progressed, Mitchell found his thoughts returning unbidden to cell 47. During lunch in the staff room, he pulled out his phone and typed the book title into a search engine, half expecting some violent martial arts manual that would justify his mockery. What he found instead gave him pause. Miyamoto Musashi had been a legendary Japanese swordsman, but the Book of Five Rings wasn't about fighting techniques. It was about strategy, discipline, and the cultivation of inner strength. The reviews described it as a philosophical text that transcended its martial origins, applicable to any form of human conflict or challenge. Mitchell set down his phone, uncomfortable with the implications. If Reeves was studying strategic thinking and self-discipline, what exactly was he preparing for? The question planted itself in Mitchell's mind like an unwelcome seed, and despite his 17 years of practiced cynicism, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he'd just witnessed something significant, a beginning, rather than another predictable moment in the monotonous prison routine. That evening, as his shift ended, Mitchell made an unexpected decision. He stopped by the prison library, found the requested title on the shelf, and checked it out using his own credentials. He wouldn't deliver it to Reeves, not yet. First, he wanted to understand what kind of wisdom this inmate was seeking in the most unlikely of places. "Reeves," Mitchell said, his voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. The inmate set down his pen and stood, but his movement carried none of the deference most prisoners showed guards. Instead, it seemed like simple respect between equals. "Officer Dawson." Mitchell pulled the book from his bag. Your request. From the library. For the first time since Mitchell had known him, Reeves's composed expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a subtle softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of his shoulders. The man accepted the book with both hands, holding it as one might hold something sacred. Thank you, Reeves said quietly. I didn't expect you to fulfill this request. Mitchell should have walked away. His duties required constant movement through the cell block, checking for problems, maintaining presence, but instead he heard himself ask, why this book? Why now? Reeves was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing how much to share. Finally he spoke. I've spent 3 years in this place, Officer Dawson. The first year I was angry at myself, at circumstances, at the universe for putting me here. The second year I was numb, just existing day to day without thought or purpose. He looked down at the book. The third year I realized that anger and numbness were both forms of defeat. I have 12 more years in this place. I can spend them diminishing, or I can spend them becoming something more than I was when I arrived. And Musashi's strategy helps with that how? The book isn't about sword fighting, though that's its surface subject. Reeves moved to the small window, sunlight casting bars of shadow across his face. It's about confronting your own nature, understanding the environment you're in, and acting with purposeful intention rather than reactive emotion. In here, those skills aren't just philosophical, they're survival tools. Mitchell thought about the encounter he'd witnessed in the yard yesterday. Jenkins approached you. I saw it from my position. Reeves nodded slowly. Jenkins operates on intimidation. He reads weakness and exploits it. But intimidation only works if you react with fear or aggression. I offered him neither. What did you say to him? I asked if he played chess. Reeves's slight smile contained no smugness, just calm certainty. He was confused by the question, which disrupted his prepared approach. Then I told him I'd been watching him move through the yard, that he had natural strategic instincts but lacked refinement. I offered to teach him chess if he was interested in developing those instincts. Mitchell felt something like awe creeping into his assessment. You turned a potential confrontation into a teaching opportunity? I turned a confrontation into a conversation, Reeves corrected gently. Whether it becomes a teaching opportunity depends on whether Jenkins returns. But by showing respect for his intelligence rather than challenging his dominance, I gave him an option besides violence. The guard looked at this man, this inmate who by all rights should have been broken by his circumstances, with new understanding. You're changing the entire dynamic of how you exist in here. I'm trying to, Reeves acknowledged. Musashi wrote that the way of strategy is the way of nature. Water flows around obstacles, doesn't crash against them repeatedly. I have 12 years of obstacles ahead. I'd prefer to flow rather than crash. Mitchell found himself nodding, then caught himself. This was getting too philosophical, too personal. He was a guard. Reeves was an inmate. Yet something had shifted between them in this conversation. Some invisible boundary had been crossed. I read some of it, Mitchell admitted. Last night, the parts about perception and rhythm. Reeves's expression showed genuine interest. And what did you think? I think, Mitchell paused, choosing his words carefully. I think I've been seeing without perceiving for a long time. Not just here, everywhere. That's the first step, Reeves said quietly. Recognition of the pattern before you can change it. A call echoed down the cell block. Another guard needing assistance with a belligerent inmate. Mitchell's radio crackled to life. He had to go, had to return to his duties, to the familiar rhythms of authority and surveillance. But as he walked away, he heard Reeves say something that followed him through the rest of his shift. Thank you again, Officer Dawson, for seeing rather than just looking. The passage struck Mitchell with sudden clarity. Reeves wasn't preparing for physical confrontation. He was mastering the underlying principles that governed all conflict. In a prison environment where violence simmered constantly beneath the surface, where hierarchies were enforced through intimidation and force, Reeves was cultivating something more fundamental, the ability to perceive threats before they materialized, to position himself strategically, to win without fighting. Mitchell's phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife about their daughter's upcoming soccer game. He realized he'd been so absorbed in the book that he'd forgotten to respond to her earlier messages. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, studying strategy and awareness, while failing to maintain presence in his own life. He set the book aside and typed a response, committing to attend the game. As he did so, he found himself wondering about Reeves's own connections beyond these walls. What relationships had the man sacrificed through his incarceration? What motivated someone to pursue this kind of disciplined self-improvement in the most limiting of circumstances? The questions multiplied, and with them came an uncomfortable recognition. Mitchell had spent 17 years looking at inmates without truly perceiving them. He'd maintained professional distance by reducing them to categories: violent, manipulative, broken, dangerous. But Reeves defied categorization. The man was transforming himself according to principles Mitchell was only beginning to comprehend, and that transformation was happening in Cell 47 under fluorescent lights that hummed their eternal drone. As Mitchell prepared for bed that night, he made a decision. Tomorrow he would deliver the book to Reeves. But more than that, he would begin paying attention, not with the cynical vigilance of a prison guard scanning for threats, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who had stumbled upon a mystery that demanded understanding. The delivery morning briefing in the staff room carried its usual mixture of bureaucratic announcements and gallows humor. Officer Rodriguez shared a story about an inmate who tried to brew alcohol in his toilet tank. Lieutenant Barnes reviewed new protocols about contraband phones. Someone made a joke about the cafeteria's mystery meat. Mitchell sat through it all with uncharacteristic distraction, the book tucked into his duty bag beneath his chair. As the briefing ended, Captain Sullivan called him aside. Sullivan was a compact man in his 50s, with gray stubble and eyes that had seen everything prison life could offer. "Dawson, you've been quiet this morning. Everything all right?" Mitchell hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Captain, you know the inmate Reeves?" "Cell 47? Sullivan's expression sharpened. "Reeves, yeah, I know him. Came in quiet, stays quiet. Model behavior so far." "Why?" "He requested a book from the library. Japanese strategy text. I checked it out to review it first. Make sure it wasn't something problematic." The captain nodded slowly. "And?" "It's philosophical material about discipline, self-improvement, strategic thinking. Nothing that violates regulations." Mitchell paused. "But it got me thinking. What do we actually know about him?" Sullivan walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "Reeves, Marcus Daniel, age 46, serving 15 years for aggravated assault. Victim was his business partner, some kind of dispute over company finances. No prior record before that. College educated, ran a successful consulting firm." He looked up. "Says here he refused to speak during his trial, wouldn't allow his lawyer to present mitigating evidence. Took the full sentence without protest." Mitchell absorbed this information. "That's unusual." "Everything about Reeves is unusual," Sullivan agreed. "I've been watching him. He's not like the others. Doesn't join any groups, doesn't create alliances, but nobody bothers him either. It's like he exists in his own space somehow." The captain closed the folder. "If he's requesting educational material, I say let him have it. God knows we need more inmates focused on self-improvement rather than survival." Mitchell nodded and left the office, but his mind churned with new questions. A successful businessman who refused to defend himself at trial? Who accepted a harsh sentence without protest? The pieces didn't fit together, suggesting a backstory Mitchell couldn't yet perceive. When he reached Cell 47 during mid-morning rounds, Reeves was sitting at the small desk, writing in a notebook with careful, deliberate strokes. The cell was remarkably organized, bed made with military precision, few possessions, everything in its designated place. "All right, I'll try it your way for a while, but if it gets me hurt, then you return to your previous methods with no judgment or from me." Reeves finished. "I'm not trying to convert you to pacifism. I'm offering tools for situations where violence isn't the optimal response. You still retain the choice of when and how to use them." Over the following weeks, Mitchell observed Price's transformation with something approaching wonder. The change wasn't complete or linear. Price still had moments of aggression, still responded to some provocations with violence, but increasingly he demonstrated the pause that Reeves emphasized, a moment of assessment before reaction, a space where choice became possible. The impact rippled outward. Other inmates noticed Price's association with Reeves's circle and began asking questions. Some approached with genuine curiosity, others with skepticism, a few with barely concealed mockery. Reeves treated all inquiries the same way, with patient explanation, offers of discussion, and no pressure to commit to anything. Officer Kimball noticed the growing influence with increasing alarm. He cornered Mitchell in the staff room one afternoon. "This needs to stop, Dawson. Reeves is creating a cult of personality. Look at the numbers. 12 regular attendees now, plus drop-ins. That's nearly 20% of the cell block." Mitchell had anticipated this conversation. "And violence is down 42%. Write-ups are down. We haven't had a serious incident in 6 weeks. By what metric is this a problem?" "By the metric of control," Kimball shot back. "Reeves is the source of that peace, which means he's also the potential source of disruption. What happens when he decides to use that influence for something other than chess and philosophy?" "You're assuming malicious intent without evidence." "I'm assuming realistic possibilities. Every gang starts with someone offering community and protection. You think the Aryan Brotherhood began by advertising racism? They offered belonging, structure, meaning. Reeves is offering the same thing with better packaging." The argument gave Mitchell pause. Was he being naive? Had his growing respect for Reeves blinded him to potential dangers? He decided to raise the concern with Captain Sullivan. The captain listened carefully to both perspectives before responding. "I'll talk to Reeves myself. Direct conversation, not accusation. If his intentions are what he claims, he'll welcome the dialogue. If not, we'll see evasion or defensiveness." Mitchell felt relieved. Sullivan had an instinct for reading people that came from 3 decades in corrections. If anyone could assess Reeves accurately, it was the captain. The captain's assessment. Captain Sullivan chose his moment carefully. He waited until late afternoon, when most of the cell block was at dinner and Reeves was alone in his cell, reading by the meager light from his window. Sullivan approached without the usual accompanying guard, a deliberate choice that signaled this was conversation rather than interrogation. "Reeves, got a minute?" Reeves looked up, and Sullivan saw no surprise in his expression, only calm attention. The inmate set aside his book and stood with that same economy of motion Sullivan had noted in his file observations. "Captain Sullivan." "Of course." Sullivan entered the cell, technically a violation of protocol to enter alone, but he'd made a career of knowing when rules served purpose and when they hindered it. He remained near the door, maintaining appropriate distance while establishing that this was dialogue between individuals rather than institutional confrontation. "I've been watching what you're building here," Sullivan began without preamble. "The chess circle, the philosophy discussions, the growing number of inmates seeking your guidance. It's having measurable positive effects. But you're concerned about where it might lead," Reeves finished calmly. Sullivan smiled slightly. "You read situations well. Yes, I'm concerned. Not because of what you're doing now, but because influence concentrated in one person creates vulnerability. For the institution. And for you." Reeves nodded slowly. "I've considered that. The risk of becoming either a target or a tool." "Have you?" Sullivan studied the other man carefully. "Then help me understand your endgame. 12 years remain on your sentence. You're cultivating leadership qualities and gathering followers. What happens when you leave? Does this all collapse? Or are you building something designed to outlast your presence?" The question landed with precision. Sullivan watched Reeves's expression, looking for the telltale signs of deception or manipulation he had learned to identify over decades. Instead, he saw thoughtful consideration. The ripple effect. 2 weeks passed before Mitchell fully recognized the changes spreading through Cell Block D. Like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, something subtle but unmistakable was transforming the atmosphere. The change wasn't dramatic, no miraculous conversions or sudden peace breaking out. Instead, it manifested in small adjustments, barely perceptible shifts in the daily patterns Mitchell had monitored for 17 years. Jenkins had returned to Reeves 3 days after their yard conversation. Mitchell had watched through the security glass as Reeves set up a makeshift chessboard on his cell desk during recreation hour, using pieces crafted from torn paper and marked with careful symbols. Jenkins sat across from him, his usual aggressive posture gradually relaxing as Reeves explained the movement of pieces, the strategic thinking behind opening gambits. What surprised Mitchell most was Jenkins's focus. The young man known for explosive violence sat completely still for 45 minutes, absorbing instruction with unexpected intensity. When the recreation hour ended, Jenkins actually thanked Reeves, a word Mitchell had never heard from the younger inmate's lips. By the second week, 3 other inmates had asked to join what was becoming an informal chess circle. Reeves accommodated them all with patient instruction, his cell becoming an unlikely hub of contemplative activity. The guards noticed. Officer Rodriguez commented that fights in cell block D had decreased markedly. Lieutenant Barnes mentioned that disciplinary write-ups were down 30% from the previous month. Mitchell knew these statistics reflected something larger than chess games. Reeves was demonstrating an alternative model of behavior, one based not on dominance hierarchies, but on mutual respect and intellectual engagement. The impact was spreading in ways that formal rehabilitation programs never achieved. But not everyone welcomed the change. Officer Drake Kimball had worked at the prison for 12 years, 3 years less than Mitchell. He was younger, harder, with a philosophy of corrections that emphasized strict control and zero tolerance. In the staff room during shift change, Kimball voiced what several guards were thinking. Anyone else notice that Reeves is building himself a little following? Kimball's tone carried suspicion. Inmates clustered around one cell, regular meetings, informal leadership structure. That's how gangs start. Mitchell looked up from his coffee. They're playing chess, Drake, teaching each other strategic thinking. That's my point exactly. Kimball leaned forward, his jaw set. Strategic thinking, planning, group coordination. You really want inmates developing those skills? The question hung in the air, and Mitchell realized the fundamental difference in their perspectives. Kimball saw inmates as permanent threats to be contained. Mitchell was beginning to see them as humans capable of transformation, given the right circumstances. You think keeping them dumb and aggressive makes us safer? Mitchell asked carefully. I think disrupting whatever natural social order exists creates unpredictability, Kimball responded. And unpredictability in a prison environment is dangerous. Captain Sullivan entered the room before Mitchell could respond. Gentlemen, if you're discussing cell block D dynamics, I want to hear it. Official channels, not gossip. Kimball straightened. Captain, I'm concerned about the social reorganization happening around inmate Reeves. He's creating an influence structure that could undermine institutional authority. Sullivan listened, his expression neutral. Officer Dawson, you have the most regular contact with Reeves. What's your assessment? Mitchell chose his words carefully. Reeves is offering an alternative to the usual prison social structures. Instead of territory and intimidation, he's building connections through intellectual engagement. The result has been measurably reduced tension in the cell block. Building connections, Kimball repeated skeptically. That's another way of saying he's recruiting. For what? Mitchell challenged. He's teaching chess and encouraging self-discipline. What's the threat in that? Sullivan held up a hand. Both perspectives have merit. Dawson, I want you to continue monitoring closely. Any sign that this becomes something other than what it appears, any indication of manipulation or hidden agendas, you report immediately. Understood? Yes, sir. Kimball, I appreciate your vigilance, but unless we observe actual policy violations or security threats, we don't shut down positive inmate activities. That's not how rehabilitation works. Kimball nodded stiffly, but his expression suggested the matter wasn't settled in his mind. That afternoon, Mitchell found himself in the library, returning the Book of Five Rings and browsing other titles. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was a civilian employee who'd worked at the prison for over 20 years. She noticed his unusual interest. Looking for something specific, Officer Dawson? Books on strategy, philosophy, self-improvement. What else do we have? Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, but she guided him to several sections. We have Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosophers, Sun Tzu's Art of War, some contemporary books on emotional intelligence and conflict resolution. May I ask what sparked this interest? Mitchell found himself explaining about Reeves, the chess circle, the measurable changes in cell block behavior. Mrs. Chen listened with careful attention. You know, she said when he finished, I've been suggesting for years that we need more structured educational programming beyond the basic GED classes. But funding is always an issue, and many staff members believe education wasted on inmates. She pulled several books from the shelf. What Reeves is doing, creating informal learning communities, that's organic rehabilitation. It's more effective than most formal programs because it's internally motivated. Mitchell accepted the book she offered. You think what he's doing should be encouraged? I think what he's doing should be studied, Mrs. Chen replied. How does one inmate, working within all the limitations of this environment, create positive social change? That's valuable knowledge. Mitchell checked out the books and carried them back to his locker. That evening, he would read Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The philosophy resonated with what he was observing. Reeves couldn't change his circumstances, the walls, the sentence, the fundamental reality of incarceration, but he was systematically changing his relationship to those circumstances, and in doing so, influencing others to do the same. The question that troubled Mitchell as he walked back through the cell block was whether the system could tolerate this kind of transformation. Prisons were designed for control, predictability, containment. What Reeves represented, autonomous growth, intellectual development, social reorganization, didn't fit neatly into institutional frameworks. As if to underscore his concerns, Mitchell witnessed a scene that evening that crystallized the tension. Reeves was walking back from dinner when another inmate, a large man named Sutherland, who ran protection rackets, deliberately bumped into him. It was a clear challenge, a test of Reeves's growing influence. The cell block went quiet. Everyone understood the dynamics at play, Sutherland reasserting the traditional power structure against Reeves's alternative model. But Reeves simply stepped back, created space, and spoke calmly. Sutherland, you're testing whether my principles hold under pressure. That's reasonable. He paused. They do. I'm not challenging your territory or your business. I'm offering something different for those who want it. There's room for both approaches in this place. Sutherland studied him, looking for weakness, for fear. Finding neither, he grunted and moved on. But Mitchell saw the calculation in the larger man's eyes. This wasn't over. It was merely postponed. As Mitchell headed home that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all moving towards some kind of confrontation. Change, even positive change, created instability. And in a prison environment, instability could turn lethal with shocking speed. The philosophy spreads, winter came to the prison with brutal efficiency, turning the recreation yard into a windswept expanse of frozen concrete. Most inmates opted for indoor recreation during these months, crowding into the day room where temperature control made existence barely tolerable. Mitchell had always hated this season. The compressed proximity increased tensions, and fights broke out with depressing regularity. This year felt different. Reeves's cell had become what inmates unofficially called the quiet zone. During recreation hours, up to 6 men would gather there, sitting on the floor or the bunk, engaging in conversations that seemed radically out of place in a maximum security facility. They discussed philosophy, strategy, and what Reeves termed adaptive responses to unchangeable circumstances. Mitchell observed these gatherings from his position in the corridor, increasingly fascinated by the transformation in the participants. Jenkins, once notorious for his hair-trigger violence and bombardment, now paused before responding to provocations. Inmate Tomas Rodriguez, serving time for armed robbery, had started a notebook where he recorded daily reflections on his behavioral patterns. Even Carter Jameson, a lifer who'd been institutionalized for over 20 years, showed signs of renewed intellectual engagement. The principles I'm sharing aren't dependent on me, Reeves has said after a pause. Musashi, Marcus Aurelius, Sun Tzu, these teachers have influenced people for centuries without personal presence. I'm just a conduit for ideas that already exist. But those philosophers didn't gather followers in a maximum security prison, Sullivan countered. Context matters. The same ideas that promote wisdom in a library can become manipulation tools in an environment built on power dynamics. True, Reeves moved to his small desk, picked up the worn copy of the Book of Five Rings. Captain, may I ask what you know about my case? About why I'm here? Sullivan considered the question. Business partner, financial dispute, assault. You took a plea, refused to present mitigating evidence. The full story is more complex, Reeves said quietly. My partner was embezzling from our clients, elderly people who'd trusted us with their retirement funds. When I discovered it, I confronted him. He denied everything, threatened to destroy evidence, and blame me. In that moment, I made a choice based on anger rather than strategy. I beat him severely. Not in self-defense, not under threat, just pure rage at his betrayal. Sullivan listened intently. This wasn't in the official record. During the trial, I realized that my anger had made me exactly what I claimed to oppose. Someone who used violence to solve problems. I could have mounted a defense about duress, emotional distress, whatever lawyers call it, but accepting full responsibility felt like the only way to actually change what I'd become. So I took the sentence and came here determined to figure out how a person transforms fundamentally. And you found your answer in ancient philosophy? I found a framework, Reeves corrected. The work is mine to do. But yes, studying how others approach self-mastery gave me tools I lacked. He met Sullivan's gaze directly. To answer your concern about my endgame, I want to leave here different than I arrived. Not just for myself, but as evidence that change is possible. If others benefit from that journey, that's meaningful. But I'm not building an organization or a following. I'm demonstrating an approach. Sullivan absorbed this, weighing sincerity against manipulation. His instincts, honed over 30 years, suggested Reeves was being genuine. But instincts could be wrong. Here's what I need from you, Sullivan said. Transparency. If your circle grows beyond what can be managed informally, we formalize it. Make it an official program with oversight. That protects you, protects the inmates involved, and gives the institution accountability. Reeves considered this. A formal program means institutional control, rules, limitations, probably restrictions on who can participate. Yes, Sullivan acknowledged, but it also means legitimacy and resources. The choice is between informal influence that makes some staff nervous or official programming that everyone understands. Which serves your actual goals better? The question hung between them. Sullivan saw the calculation happening behind Reeves's eyes. Not manipulation, but genuine strategic thinking about how to achieve meaningful outcomes within systemic constraints. If we formalize it, Reeves said slowly, I want certain conditions. Voluntary participation only. No religious or ideological requirements. Focus on practical philosophy and strategic thinking. Not conversion to any particular worldview. And the freedom to include anyone, regardless of their crime or reputation, as long as they're willing to engage seriously. Sullivan smiled. These were reasonable requests that actually aligned with best practices for rehabilitation programming. I can work with that, put together a proposal, structure, goals, meeting frequency, whatever you think makes sense. I'll review it with the warden and push for approval. Why? Reeves asked directly. Why are you supporting this? Sullivan moved toward the cell door, then paused. Because in 30 years of this work, I've seen two kinds of inmates. Those who do their time and leave exactly as broken as they arrived, just harder. And those rare few who actually transform, who use these walls as a crucible rather than just a cage. You're the second kind. And if you can help others become that kind too, that's worth institutional support. As Sullivan walked back through the cell block, he felt the weight of the decision he had just made. Formalizing Reeves's work would draw attention from staff, from other inmates, potentially from authorities outside the prison. It could end badly in numerous ways, but it could also end well, and Sullivan had spent too many years watching the first kind of outcome. He was ready to take a calculated risk on the second. But it was the arrival of Daniel Price that truly demonstrated the reach of what Reeves was building. Price had transferred from another facility with a reputation that preceded him. Assault on multiple guards, time in segregation, a jacket thick with disciplinary infractions. He was 32, built like a middleweight fighter, and carried himself with the coiled aggression of someone always 3 seconds from explosion. Mitchell watched Price's first interaction with Reeves during a yard time. The temperature had climbed just enough for outdoor recreation, and Reeves stood in his usual spot near the fence, engaged in what appeared to be slow-motion movements. Mitchell had learned these were exercises from Reeves's study of strategy, deliberate, focused motions designed to cultivate awareness and control. Price approached with two other inmates flanking him, his body language broadcasting threat. "You're the guy everyone's talking about, the philosopher." Reeves completed his movement before turning. "Daniel Price, you arrived 3 days ago from Oakwood Correctional." Price's eyes narrowed. "You tracking me?" "I pay attention to my environment," Reeves replied calmly. "It's one of the principles I'm studying. You have a choice to make, same as everyone who arrives here." "That right?" Price's voice dripped sarcasm. "And what choice is that? Whether to repeat the patterns that brought you to this moment, or to experiment with different approaches?" Reeves gestured to the yard around them. "This place will either make you harder or wiser. The outcome depends entirely on which you choose to pursue." Price laughed, but the sound lacked genuine amusement. "Wisdom. In here, you're delusional." "Maybe," Reeves acknowledged without defensiveness, "but my delusion is more productive than resignation. When you're ready to discuss it seriously, you know where to find me." He turned back to his exercises, effectively ending the conversation. Price stood there for a moment, clearly unused to being dismissed without confrontation. Then, surprisingly, he walked away without escalating. Mitchell marked the interaction as significant. Most inmates would have either cowered before Price's reputation or matched his aggression. Reeves had done neither. He'd simply offered an alternative and then withdrawn attention, giving Price no emotional fuel to ignite. 3 days later, Price appeared at Reeves's cell during recreation hour. Mitchell happened to be conducting a routine inspection nearby and overheard their conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said," Price began without preamble, "about choices." Reeves looked up from the book he'd been reading, one of the philosophy texts Mrs. Chen had recommended to Mitchell. And I'm tired of being angry all the time," Price admitted, his voice dropping. "It's exhausting, but I don't know how to be anything else. Anger's kept me alive in places like this." Reeves nodded slowly. "Anger is a tool, sometimes necessary, but if it's your only tool, every problem looks like something to smash. Sit down, let's talk about other tools." What followed was a conversation that Mitchell found himself listening to with complete attention, pretending to inspect the cell across the corridor while his mind absorbed every word. "The philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote from a very different place than this," Reeves explained, "but his principles translate. He said, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment." Price frowned. "That sounds like blame the victim philosophy." "People do real things to you in places like this." "Absolutely," Reeves agreed. "I'm not suggesting that external threats aren't real. But your response to those threats, that's always within your control. Anger is one response. Strategic thinking is another. The question is which one serves your long-term interests better. Strategic thinking doesn't stop someone from shanking you in the shower. True, but situational awareness does. Predictable alliances do. Reputation management does. All of which require calm assessment rather than reactive emotion." Reeves leaned forward slightly. "You've survived this long on anger and intimidation. I'm suggesting you've survived despite those strategies, not because of them. How many times have those approaches escalated situations that could have been resolved differently?" Price was silent for a long moment. "More than I can count," he finally admitted. "Then maybe it's worth experimenting with alternatives. Not abandoning your ability to respond to threats, just adding other options to your repertoire." Mitchell watched Price's expression show through several emotions: skepticism, consideration, something that might have been hope. Finally, the younger man nodded. Later that evening in his office, Sullivan drafted an email to Warden Patricia Morse. He chose his words carefully, framing the proposal in terms of reduced violence, improved institutional climate, and innovative rehabilitation approaches. He attached statistics, highlighted the measurable benefits, and emphasized the oversight structure he'd negotiated with Reeves. Before sending, he reread the message 3 times. This would either launch something significant or blow up spectacularly. There was no middle ground. Sullivan hit send and leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, the prison yard lay empty in the gathering darkness, floodlights casting harsh illumination across concrete and razor wire. Somewhere in cell block D, Reeves was probably reading by his inadequate cell light, studying ancient strategies for modern application. "Let's see what you're really made of," Sullivan murmured to the empty office. The response from Warden Morse came faster than expected, a request for a meeting the following morning. Sullivan noted the early timing and the brevity of the message. Not a good sign, but not necessarily a bad one either. He gathered his materials and prepared his arguments, knowing that the next conversation would determine whether Reeves's experiment became institutional policy or got shut down entirely. The tension of that uncertainty followed him home, where he found himself reading about Musashi and Marcus Aurelius late into the night, trying to understand what had captured Reeves's commitment so completely. "The obstacle is the way," he read from Aurelius. Sullivan thought about walls, literal and metaphorical, and wondered if maybe that's what Reeves understood that others missed. The prison wasn't just containing him. He was using it, transforming limitation into opportunity. The question was whether the institution could handle that kind of paradox. The proposal warden, Patricia Morse, had run correctional facilities for 23 years, ascending through the ranks from guard to administrator through a combination of competence, political acumen, and genuine commitment to rehabilitation principles that often conflicted with budget realities. At 56, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd seen every manipulation, every sincere reform effort, and every tragic outcome prisons could produce. She read Sullivan's proposal 3 times before their scheduled meeting, making notes in the margins, cross-referencing his statistics with her own data. The numbers were undeniable. Cell Block D had shown marked improvement across every metric since Reeves's arrival. But numbers could be coincidence, correlation rather than causation, or temporary fluctuations that would revert to mean. What interested her more was Sullivan's tone. The captain was not a man given to enthusiasms. His career had been defined by steady pragmatism and careful risk assessment, though. For him to advocate this strongly suggested something beyond typical inmate rehabilitation claims. When Sullivan entered her office the next morning, Morse gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Walk me through this, Captain." "Not the statistics, I've seen those. Tell me about the man himself. What makes Reeves different?" Sullivan had prepared for this question. "He has genuine self-awareness, Warden. Most inmates either maintain their innocence or rationalize their crimes. Reeves accepted full responsibility, understood his actions as a failure of character, and committed to systematic self-transformation. That's rare enough to be noteworthy. What makes it remarkable is the methodology he's developed, and more importantly, his ability to teach it to others." "Teach what exactly?" Morse leaned back in her chair. "Philosophy? Strategy? These aren't typical rehabilitation focus areas." "Teach adaptive response patterns," Sullivan clarified. "How to pause between stimulus and reaction. How to assess situations strategically rather than emotionally. How to maintain personal agency even in circumstances that severely limit freedom. It's practical psychology dressed up in historical texts." Morse tapped her pen against the proposal. "I'm concerned about the concentration of influence." 12 regular participants, you said? That's a power base. What prevents Reeves from using that influence inappropriately? "Formal structure prevents it," Sullivan responded. "Right now, it's informal, which actually gives him more latitude for manipulation if that were his intent. By formalizing the program, we bring it under institutional oversight, regular monitoring, documented activities, clear boundaries. Or we legitimize his influence and give him institutional backing to expand it." Sullivan nodded, acknowledging the counter-argument. "That's the risk. But consider the alternative. We shut it down, return to status quo, and lose the gains we've already achieved. Plus, we send a message that positive inmate initiative gets punished. That's its own problem. Morse stood and walked to her window, looking out over the facility she managed. 400 inmates, 160 staff members, endless regulations, chronic underfunding, and constant pressure from oversight bodies that wanted both maximum security and meaningful rehabilitation. Every decision carried consequences that rippled through the entire system. "I want to meet him," she said finally. "Reeves, before I approve anything, I need to assess him personally." Sullivan had expected this. "I can arrange that. Standard protocol or more informal?" "Informal. Bring him to the education building conference room. No guards visible, though they'll be nearby. I want to see how he presents himself when the power dynamic is somewhat leveled." 2 days later, the meeting convened. Reeves entered the conference room with that same controlled awareness Sullivan had come to recognize. He wore standard prison blues, but somehow carried himself without the institutional shuffle most inmates developed. When Morse extended her hand, Reeves shook it with firm professionalism, neither subservient nor presumptuous. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for meeting with me." "Warden Morse, the opportunity is appreciated." They sat across from each other at the conference table, Sullivan positioned slightly to the side, present but not intermediating. Morse studied Reeves with the assessment skills that had made her effective in her role. "Captain Sullivan has proposed formalizing your educational activities into an official program. Before I consider approval, I need to understand your intentions and methods. Tell me about the transformation you have undergone since arriving here." Reeves took a moment before responding, and Morse noted the pause. Not hesitation, but deliberate consideration. "I arrived angry, Warden. At myself primarily, but that anger bled into everything. I was dangerous in the way that desperate men are dangerous. Unpredictable, volatile, barely contained. The first year was about survival. The second was about numbing myself to that survival. The third year, I realized I had 12 more years ahead, and I could either use them or lose them." "So you chose philosophy?" "I chose structure," Reeves corrected gently. "Philosophy gave me that structure. Musashi's strategic principles, Stoic approaches to adversity, Sun Tzu's emphasis on knowing yourself and your environment. These were not abstractions. They were practical tools for maintaining sanity and purpose in circumstances designed to strip both away." Morse leaned forward slightly. "And you decided to share these tools with others. Why?" "Initially, I didn't decide anything," Reeves admitted. "An inmate asked what I was reading. We talked, others joined. What started as casual conversation became something more deliberate when I realized the impact it was having, not just on others, but on me. Teaching forces clarity. You can't effectively share principles unless you understand them deeply enough to explain them multiple ways. The teaching deepened my own practice. But now you have influence," Morse pressed. "A following, essentially. In an environment where influence equals power, how do I trust that you won't leverage that power inappropriately?" Reeves met her gaze directly. "You don't. Trust isn't something I can demand or prove through words, but consider what I'm teaching. Self-control, strategic patience, long-term thinking over immediate gratification. Those principles fundamentally oppose the manipulation and violence that characterize most prison power structures. If I were building a gang, I'd be teaching very different lessons." "Gangs also offer community, purpose, and protection," Morse countered. "The same things you're offering." "True. The difference is in what I ask in return. Gangs demand loyalty, obedience, violence on command. I ask for honest engagement, willingness to question your own patterns, commitment to personal growth. Those aren't gang recruitment tactics. They're educational principles." Sullivan watched the exchange, impressed by both Reeves's clarity and Morse's probing. The warden wasn't accepting easy answers. "Here's my concern, Mr. Reeves. You have 12 years remaining on your sentence. You're developing leadership skills, strategic thinking, interpersonal influence, all valuable for reintegration into society. But what happens to the men you're working with when you leave? Does this all collapse? Do they lose the structure and support you've provided, potentially regressing to previous behaviors?" Reeves nodded slowly. "That's a valid concern. Which is why formalization helps. If this becomes an institutional program rather than my personal project, it outlasts my presence. Other facilitators can be trained. The curriculum can be documented. The structure persists beyond any individual. You'd be willing to hand over control? Morse asked skeptically. I'd be willing to share facilitation, Reeves clarified. The goal isn't my control. It's the availability of these tools for anyone who wants them. If that means training staff members or other inmates to co-facilitate, I welcome that. The principles aren't proprietary. They've existed for centuries. I'm just adapting them for this specific context. Morse stood and walked to the window, her back to them. If I approve this, there will be conditions. Regular reporting, documented activities, oversight from education staff. Any sign of manipulation or inappropriate use of influence, the program ends immediately. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I welcome it, Reeves has said. Accountability serves the work. If I can't demonstrate positive outcomes under observation, then either my methods are flawed or my intentions aren't what I claim. Either way, scrutiny helps reveal that. Morse turned back to face him. You are more articulate than most inmates I encounter, more self-aware. I'm inclined to approve Captain Sullivan's proposal on a probationary basis. 6 months. We'll evaluate outcomes quarterly. But understand, one incident, one security concern, anything that suggests this is something other than educational programming, and it ends. Clear? Completely clear, Warden. Thank you for the opportunity. As Reeves was escorted back to cell block D, Morse and Sullivan remained in the conference room. The warden poured coffee from the carafe on the side table, offering a cup to Sullivan. Your assessment? She asked. He's genuine. I'd stake my reputation on it. You just did. Morse sipped on her coffee. This could be remarkable or disastrous. Let's hope your instincts are as good as your track record suggests. The announcement went up on the Cell Block D bulletin board 3 days later, printed on official letterhead that gave weight to what had previously been informal. Strategic Life Management Program, now accepting applications. Mitchell watched the reactions ripple through the block. Some inmates were skeptical. Anything officially sanctioned by the administration couldn't be genuinely helpful. Others were curious, especially those who'd observed the changes in Jenkins, Price, and the other regular participants. A few expressed open hostility, seeing the formalization as Reeves selling out to the system. Reeves himself seemed neither elated nor concerned by the development. When Mitchell congratulated him during afternoon rounds, the inmate simply nodded. Now the real work begins. Informality allowed flexibility, but lacked accountability. Structure provides accountability, but risks rigidity. We'll see if I can navigate that balance. The first official session was scheduled for Thursday evening in the education building's largest classroom. Capacity was set at 20 participants, with applications reviewed by a committee consisting of Captain Sullivan, Mrs. Chen from the library, and Sarah Okonkwo, the prison's educational coordinator. They received 37 applications. Mitchell, curious about the selection process, asked Sullivan about the criteria. Diverse representation, the captain explained. We want different cell blocks, various crimes, mixed sentence lengths, age diversity, not just cherry-picking the easiest candidates. Reeves suggested including some high-risk individuals, said the principles matter most for those who struggle most. Bold choice, but it demonstrates confidence in his methods. The approved list included Daniel Price, as expected, but also names that surprised Mitchell. Sutherland, the protection racket operator who challenged Reeves months earlier. Aaron Chen, a young man serving time for vehicular manslaughter, prone to depression and self-harm. Marcus Webb, a 62-year-old lifer who'd been institutionalized so long that staff barely remembered he existed. Thursday evening arrived with unusual tension. Mitchell volunteered to work security for the first session, officially to ensure safety, privately because he wanted to witness this transition from informal circle to institutional program. The classroom had been arranged with chairs in a rough circle. Reeves's request, approved despite being non-standard. As participants filed in, Mitchell noted their body language. Some carried defensive postures, arms crossed, expressions skeptical. Others showed cautious openness. A few, like Jenkins and Rodriguez, moved with familiar ease, having attended informal sessions for months. Reeves entered last, carrying only a notebook and 3 books. He positioned himself in the circle rather than at the front of the room, another deliberate choice that equalized rather than elevated his position. "Thank you all for applying and being selected," he began without preamble. "This is now an official program, which changes some dynamics. There will be documentation, oversight, evaluation. But the core purpose remains unchanged: developing practical tools for maintaining agency, purpose, and personal growth in circumstances that actively oppose all three." Sutherland spoke up, his voice carrying challenge. "Sounds like institutional propaganda. Turn us into model prisoners so administration looks good." Instead of defensive response, Reeves nodded. "That's a reasonable suspicion. Let me address it directly. Yes, if this works, the administration benefits: reduced violence, fewer disciplinary issues, better institutional climate. Those are administrative wins. But those same outcomes also mean you do easier time, less conflict, more mental clarity, better preparation for eventual release. Our interests align even if our motivations differ." "And what's your motivation?" This from Aaron Chen, the young man Mitchell knew struggled with guilt over the death he'd caused. 12 more years, Reeves said simply. "I can spend them diminishing or developing. I choose development. Teaching accelerates my own learning. Your growth supports my growth. It's pragmatic rather than altruistic." The honesty seemed to settle something in the room. Mitchell noticed shoulders relaxing slightly, the defensive postures easing. "Let's start with a foundational principle," Reeves continued. Musashi wrote, "Today is victory over yourself of yesterday. Tomorrow is your victory over lesser men." This isn't about defeating others. It's about progressive self-improvement. Each day, can you be slightly more intentional than yesterday? That's the only competition that matters in here. For the next 90 minutes, Mitchell watched Reeves facilitate discussion with remarkable skill. He didn't lecture. Instead, he posed questions, drew out experiences from participants, and connected their lived reality to philosophical principles. When tensions arose, as they did when Sutherland and Price began arguing about different approaches to conflict, Reeves didn't shut it down but channeled it productively. "You're both describing valid strategies," he observed. "Sutherland emphasizes maintaining reputation through consistent demonstration of consequences. Price suggests selective engagement based on strategic assessment. The question isn't which is right, but which serves specific goals in specific contexts. What outcomes are you each trying to achieve?" The reframing shifted the argument from territorial to analytical. Both men had to articulate their reasoning, which revealed underlying assumptions they hadn't consciously examined. By session's end, they hadn't agreed, but they'd achieved something more valuable: mutual understanding of different strategic frameworks. As participants filed out, several thanked Reeves. A few lingered to ask questions. Mitchell noted that even the skeptical ones left looking thoughtful rather than dismissive. Sarah Okonkwo, the educational coordinator, who'd observed from the back of the room, approached Mitchell. That was remarkable. He facilitated like someone with formal training. Any idea where he developed those skills? Mitchell shook his head. For here, he ran a consulting firm. Maybe business experience translates. "Maybe," Sarah said thoughtfully. "But what I just watched went beyond business facilitation. That was therapeutic group dynamics, conflict resolution, Socratic method teaching. Either he's naturally gifted or he's been studying pedagogy along with philosophy." The observation intrigued Mitchell. Over the following weeks, he paid closer attention to Reeves's methodology. The man seemed to have an instinctive sense of when to push and when to support, when to let silence settle, and when to redirect. Group dynamics shifted under his guidance in ways that seemed almost choreographed, yet completely organic. The program met twice weekly. Attendance remained high. All 20 participants came regularly, and the waiting list grew to over 40 names. The impact began showing in measurable ways. Violence incidents dropped another 15% across the facility. Educational program enrollment increased. Even medical reported fewer stress-related complaints. But success created its own tensions. Officer Kimball's concerns intensified rather than diminished. He began documenting everything about the program, building a file of observations he shared with like-minded staff members who viewed Reeves's influence as institutional threat. Look at the language that participants are using, Kimball argued during a staff meeting. Strategic thinking, adaptive responses, environmental assessment. These are military terms repurposed. He's training them to be more effective operators, not better people. The results argue otherwise, Sullivan countered, unless you think reduced violence and improved behavior are negative outcomes. I think we're teaching inmates to hide their true intentions more effectively. Violence hasn't disappeared, it's just being redirected or postponed. We won't know the real impact until something triggers it. The debate continued without resolution, creating divisions among staff that mirrored the transformation happening among inmates. The prison was becoming a test case for fundamentally different philosophies of corrections, punitive containment versus rehabilitative transformation. Mitchell found himself increasingly aligned with Sullivan's perspective, though he understood Kimball's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Influence could be weaponized, skills could be misused, trust could be exploited. But watching Reeves work, observing the genuine changes in men like Price and Chen, and even hardened lifers like Webb, Mitchell believed the risk was worth taking. Sometimes transformation required faith in human capacity for growth, especially in those who'd proven capable of great harm. The real test would come when that faith was challenged. The crisis, it happened during the 6th week of the formalized program, on a Tuesday afternoon when institutional routines created predictable vulnerabilities. Marcus Webb, the 62-year-old lifer, failed to report to his assigned work detail in the kitchen. For a man who'd maintained perfect institutional behavior for 3 decades, the absence immediately triggered concern. Officer Rodriguez discovered Webb in an unused storage room near the education building, sitting on the concrete floor with a razor blade in his hand. The discovery sent ripples of alarm through the facility. Suicide attempts required immediate protocol activation, full investigation, potential program suspensions if mental health concerns could be traced to any institutional activity. Mitchell was first on scene after Rodriguez called it in. Webb looked up as Mitchell entered, his eyes carrying decades of weariness. The razor blade sat in his open palm, not pressed to skin, but held as possibility. "Marcus," Mitchell said carefully, keeping his voice level, "talk to me." "What's happening?" Webb's laugh was bitter. "What's happening?" "I finally woke up. That's what's happening. Reeves and his philosophy showed me what I could have been if I'd learned these things 40 years ago. And now I realize I have nothing ahead but more of this until I die. No release date, no future, just existence until cessation. The awareness is torture." Rodriguez stood by the door, radio ready, but Mitchell gestured for him to hold. This required conversation, not force. "The program gave you that awareness?" Mitchell asked. "The program gave me clarity," Webb corrected. "First time in 30 years I've seen myself clearly. What I was, what I became, what I'll never be. Strategic thinking, adaptive response, personal growth. What's the point when there's no life to apply them to?" Mitchell felt the weight of the moment. This could shut down everything Reeves had built. A suicide directly connected to program participation would mean immediate termination, probably investigation, possibly criminal charges if negligence could be proven. But more than that, a man's life hung in genuine crisis. "Put the blade down, Marcus. Let's talk this through." "What's there to talk through? I'm 62 years old, serving life without parole. I'll die in here." That was true before the program, but I didn't feel it like I feel it now. "What do you feel now that you didn't before?" Webb's hands shook slightly. "Possibility. That's what tortures me. For the first time since I was 23, I can imagine being someone worthwhile. And that imagination makes this cage unbearable." Mitchell made a decision that would either save the situation or end his career. "Rodriguez, call it in as a medical check, non-emergency. Then go tell Captain Sullivan we need Reeves in the education building conference room, immediately, with his approval." Rodriguez hesitated. "Protocol says," "I know what protocol says. Do it anyway." 10 minutes later, Mitchell escorted a still unharmed Webb into the conference room where Reeves waited with Captain Sullivan. The setup violated numerous regulations, but Sullivan had authorized it based on Mitchell's assessment that conventional intervention would fail. Reeves looked at Webb without surprise, as if he'd been expecting this conversation. "Marcus, you've reached the awareness crisis," Webb looked up sharply. "You knew this would happen?" "I knew it was possible. The philosophy I'm teaching wakes people up. Sometimes awakening hurts more than sleeping." "Then why teach it?" Webb's voice carried raw pain. "Why make me aware of everything I'll never have?" Reeves pulled a chair close and sat at Webb's level. "Because awareness is the prerequisite for everything else. Yes, you are serving life. That's unchangeable. But how you serve that life, the internal experience of these years, that's completely within your control. The question isn't whether you'll leave these walls physically. It's whether you'll be imprisoned mentally for whatever time remains." Easy for you to say. You have a release date. True. But I didn't when I started this work. I began studying these principles when I thought I might die in here, when the possibility of release seemed impossible. The transformation wasn't for some future freedom. It was for the present moment's livability. Webb shook his head. "I can't do 30 more years of this with full awareness." The numbness was mercy. "Numbness was survival," Reeves corrected gently. "But survival isn't living. What you're experiencing right now, this crisis, is actually the birth of real living. It just feels like dying because you're letting go of the comfortable lies you've told yourself for decades." Mitchell watched this exchange, acutely aware that Reeves was navigating psychological terrain far beyond typical inmate interaction. One wrong word could push Webb over the edge, but Reeves seemed to understand exactly where the pressure points were. "Marcus Aurelius wrote something relevant," Reeves continued. "Confine yourself to the present. You're torturing yourself with 30 years of imagined future. But you don't have 30 years. Nobody does, release date or not. You have this moment. Can you make this moment meaningful? That's the only question that matters. One moment at a time for 30 years? Webb's voice broke. "That's not a life." "That's literally how everyone lives," Reeves responded. "We just tell ourselves comfortable stories about futures we might not reach. You're being forced to confront the reality everyone else avoids. That this moment is all any of us truly has. That's not a curse. It's liberation, if you can accept it." Silence settled over the room. Captain Sullivan remained motionless, letting Reeves work. Mitchell held his breath, watching Webb's expression shift through various emotions. Pain, anger, consideration, something that might have been understanding. "If I accept that," Webb finally said, "if I choose to stay alive and conscious, what does that look like practically? What do I do with aware time?" "What you've been doing," Reeves said, "you come to sessions. You engage with ideas. You help younger inmates understand long-term perspective that only someone with your experience can offer. You read, you think, you grow. The circumstances don't change, but your relationship to the circumstances transforms completely." Webb was quiet for a long moment. "The razor blade was a tool," Reeves finished. "One option among several. You chose conversation instead. That choice is the practice, assessing options, making intentional decisions rather than reactive ones. You just demonstrated the core principle under the most extreme circumstances." Something shifted in Webb's posture. The crisis energy that had filled the room began dissipating, replaced by exhausted resolution. He set the razor blade on the table between them. "I'll need a lot of support," Webb said quietly. "You'll have it," Reeves promised. "This group is built on mutual support. That's not charity, it's necessity. We all face versions of this crisis. The circumstances differ, but the fundamental challenge is the same. How to maintain meaningful existence in circumstances designed to crush meaning." Captain Sullivan finally spoke. "Marcus, you're going to medical for evaluation. Standard protocol. Officer Mitchell will escort you, but I want your commitment that you'll use appropriate channels if you hit this crisis point again." Webb nodded slowly. "I commit. But Captain, the program didn't cause this. It revealed it. If I'd stayed numb, I'd have succeeded eventually. At least now I have reasons to choose differently." As Mitchell escorted Webb to medical, he felt the immense weight of what had just occurred. The crisis could still shut down the program, Suicide ideation connected to institutional activities required investigation regardless of outcome. But something significant had happened in that room beyond crisis intervention. He'd witnessed profound philosophical counseling under impossible circumstances. Later that evening, Mitchell found Reeves alone in his cell, writing in his notebook. The inmate looked up, his face showing the strain of the day's events. "That was remarkable," Mitchell said quietly. "What you did for Webb." Reeves set down his pen. "I didn't do anything except offer perspective he could have found in any philosophy text. The work was his, choosing conversation over cessation. You knew this kind of crisis was possible. Why didn't you warn people? Because warning them would have prevented the necessary breakthrough. Awareness crises are part of genuine transformation. You can't grow without confronting painful truths. The question isn't whether to avoid the crisis, but whether support exists to navigate through it." Mitchell leaned against the cell door frame. The program might not survive this. Even with Webb's statement that it helped rather than caused his crisis, some people will argue we're playing with psychological fire. "Maybe we are," Reeves acknowledged, "but the alternative is letting people sleep through their sentences until they die, never having truly lived. I don't think that's more humane, it's just more comfortable for observers." The next morning, Warden Morse called an emergency meeting to review the incident. Epilogue. 9 years later, Marcus Daniel Reeves walked through the prison gates for the last time. He carried a single bag containing his possessions, several books, notebooks filled with reflections and curriculum materials, and letters from former program participants tracking their own journeys. Officer Mitchell Dawson, now Captain Dawson, walked him to the gate. The Strategic Life Management Program was in its 10th year, active in all 6 cell blocks, with a documented 67% reduction in recidivism among participants. Marcus Webb's writings had been published in 3 academic journals. Daniel Price was completing facilitator training to work with newly arrived inmates. "Any advice for the world outside?" Mitchell asked as they reached the final checkpoint. Reeves smiled. "Same advice that applies inside. Confine yourself to the present. Perceive rather than just see. Understand that circumstances don't control you. Your relationship to circumstances does. The walls change, but the principles remain." They shook hands, not as guard and inmate, but as 2 men who'd traveled an unexpected journey together and emerged transformed. As Reeves stepped into freedom, he turned back once. "Thank you for taking the request seriously, for seeing possibility instead of just risk." Mitchell nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. He watched Reeves walk away, moving with that same intentional awareness that had first caught his attention a decade earlier. The book had changed everything, but it wasn't the book alone. It was one man's commitment to transformation, another man's willingness to support it, and an institution's courage to believe that even in the most limiting circumstances, human beings remain capable of extraordinary growth. The story didn't end at the prison gates. It continued in every conversation Reeves would have, every principle he would teach, every person he would influence in the free world. And it continued behind those walls, where men still gathered to study strategy, to discuss philosophy, and to discover that the greatest battle was always the one within. The guard had laughed, then he had learned. And in learning, he had helped transform not just one man, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible when human potential met dedicated purpose. The Book of 5 Rings remained in the prison library, checked out regularly by new arrivals beginning their own journeys. And in cell 47, a new inmate would soon sit cross-legged on the bunk, eyes closed in meditation, beginning to understand that walls could contain bodies but never had to contain spirits. The transformation was complete, but more accurately, it was never complete. It was continuous, rippling outward, touching lives in ways both measurable and mysterious, proving that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the simplest request. "I'd like to request a book from the library."